On the night of August 21, 1955, a frightened family rushed into a police station in Kentucky with a story that sounded impossible. They said their farmhouse had been surrounded for hours, not by intruders and not by animals they could clearly identify, but by small humanoid figures appearing in the dark, at the windows, on the roof, near the trees, and all around the house. The men had fired at them more than once, and according to the family, it made almost no difference. The figures kept coming back. When police saw the group, they did not see people laughing, improvising, or trying to stage some kind of performance. They saw adults in visible distress, children crying, and a household that appeared genuinely shaken. One of the main witnesses, Billy Ray Taylor, was described as being so agitated that his pulse was measured at around 140 beats per minute. Officers also reported no obvious signs of intoxication. That does not prove strange creatures surrounded the house that night, but it matters because whatever happened out there, the fear inside that house seemed real. And that is what makes the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter so difficult to dismiss.
Not because it proves extraterrestrials, and not because every detail has to be taken literally, but because a large group of people claimed they had endured a prolonged siege by something they could not explain. Police treated the situation seriously, and decades later, the case still resists any fully satisfying explanation. What happened there became one of the most famous incidents in American UFO history, but the deeper question is not whether this was a perfect alien encounter. It is why the episode remained so strange, so persistent, and so difficult to reduce to something simple.
The case took place in rural Christian County, Kentucky, in the area between Kelly and Hopkinsville. This was not a city street encounter, and it was not a passing roadside sighting. It centered on a modest farmhouse where a family and their guests were gathered on a late summer night. There were 11 people at the house, adults, children, relatives, and visitors. Among the names most closely associated with the case were Billy Ray Taylor, Lucky Sutton, J.C. Sutton, and Glennie Langford, the family matriarch. That detail matters because Hopkinsville did not begin as a lone witness story. It began inside a crowded house with a collective event, a shared night, and a shared fear.
And Glennie Langford, in particular, would later stand out in the way many researchers described her. She was often portrayed as simple, religious, private, and not especially drawn to fantasy or public spectacle. That does not automatically make every detail true, but it helps explain why the case was not dismissed so easily by everyone who looked into it. Over time, the event became known by several names: the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, the Hopkinsville Goblins case, and, through media distortion, one of the incidents most closely tied to the phrase "little green men," even though the witnesses themselves did not describe the figures as green. That distinction matters because the image that entered popular culture was not always the same as the story the family originally told. And if this case still carries weight today, it is not because of the caricature that came later. It is because of what reportedly unfolded over the course of hours in and around that house. To understand why the case endured, we have to go back to the beginning, to the first strange light, and to the moment the night stopped feeling ordinary. The night did not begin with creatures at the window. It began with something in the sky. At some point that evening, Billy Ray Taylor went outside to fetch water from the well. While he was out there, he later claimed he saw a bright object moving across the sky. Descriptions vary slightly depending on the source, but the general image remains consistent. A bright, metallic or silvery object, unusual in appearance, leaving behind a multicolored trail and descending somewhere beyond the field or tree line. Taylor came back visibly alarmed, but the people inside the house were skeptical. The The simplest interpretation was that he had probably seen a meteor. And to be fair, that possibility remains important because as an explanation for the initial light in the sky, a meteor is not only plausible, it may be the strongest ordinary explanation for that part of the story. But even if that explains the first moment of the night, it does not explain what followed. Not long after that, the atmosphere around the house began to change. The family dog reportedly became agitated and ran for cover. That detail matters more than it may seem, because in stories like this, the shift from normalcy often begins before anyone fully understands why the tension is building. Then came the next unsettling element, a glow in the darkness, movement outside, and the sense that something was approaching the house. Billy Ray Taylor and Lucky Sutton went out to look, and according to their account, what they saw was neither an ordinary person nor an animal they could easily identify. A small figure was coming toward them. That is the moment when the case stops being merely a story about a strange light in the sky and becomes something much harder to classify. From that point on, the night no longer moved toward curiosity. It moved toward fear, because what appeared outside the house would not remain a single glimpse. It would return again and again, at the windows, near the roof, in the trees, and around the property. And that is what transformed the event from an unusual sighting into what many of the witnesses later described as a siege. What followed is the part of the Hopkinsville case that gave it lasting power. Not just a sighting, and not just a shape in the dark, but a prolonged series of appearances around the house, repeated often enough and from enough different positions that the witnesses came to feel they were being watched, surrounded, and tested. According to the family, the first figure they saw was small. Most descriptions placed it somewhere between 2.5 and 4 feet tall. The appeared head large and rounded. The eyes were described as oversized, bright, and striking in the dark. The arms seemed unusually long, and the hands were sometimes described as claw-like or as having long fingers. In several retellings, the body had a metallic, silvery, or reflective quality. Some reports mentioned large ears or pointed features. Others were less specific. There were small differences depending on the witness and the source, but the central pattern remained stable. Small figures, large heads, bright eyes, long arms, and an unnatural way of moving. That last detail may be the most important, because what disturbed the witnesses was not only how the figures looked, it was how they behaved. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor opened fire, and according to the story, the reaction was bizarre. Instead of collapsing like an ordinary intruder, the figures seemed to recoil, flip, glide, or retreat with strange control. Some accounts describe movements that looked almost weightless. Others say they drifted backward or dropped in an unusual way, as if the impact had not affected them normally. There were also reports of a metallic sound, as though bullets had struck metal or something like a bucket. That detail has been repeated for decades. It does not prove what they were shooting at, but it helps explain why the people inside the house felt they were dealing with something outside their normal experience. And the figures did not appear only once. They were reportedly seen at the windows, on the roof, near the trees, and in the yard, watching, appearing, disappearing, and then returning from another angle. Again and again, the pattern was not a direct attack. It was presence, observation, and encroachment, the sensation of being surrounded by things that would not fully advance, but would also not leave. One of the most dramatic moments came when a figure was said to have appeared near the roofline. In one version of the story, a hand or claw-like appendage reached down and grabbed Billy Ray Taylor by the hair. Whether taken literally or not, that image became one of the most memorable elements of the case because it shifted the experience from distant fear to immediate physical proximity. Something was no longer just outside the house, something was close enough to touch. And still, despite the tension, one detail stands out. The creatures did not seem to force their way inside. They watched, they appeared at openings, they moved around the property, and they seemed to test the boundaries of the space, but they did not break through the door and storm the house. That made the event stranger, not simpler.
For hours, according to the witnesses, the cycle continued. A figure appears, someone reacts, shots are fired, the figure retreats or vanishes, then another appears somewhere else. The house becomes a center of tension, and the darkness outside becomes active. And what began as one man claiming he saw something strange in the sky became a collective night of fear, in which multiple people inside the same house believed they were being besieged by something they could not understand. That is the core of Hopkinsville. Not merely creatures and not merely appearance, but a sustained encounter that behaved like a siege. And eventually, the fear inside that house reached the point where staying was no longer an option. At some point, the family decided they could not stay there any longer. Whatever they believed was outside the house, they no longer felt capable of handling it on their own. So they left. The group drove into Hopkinsville and went to the police. That decision is one of the strongest parts of the case, because this was not a story told the next day after rumors had spread and memories had settled. It was an immediate reaction, a frightened group arriving at a police station at night and asking for help. And when officers saw them, the impression they left was important. They did not seem amused. They did not seem relaxed. They did not look like people enjoying a prank. They looked shaken. Children were crying. Adults were visibly distressed, and Billy Ray Taylor was reportedly so agitated that his pulse was measured at around 140 beats per minute. Police also found no obvious sign that the group was drunk or intoxicated. That alone does not confirm the story they told, but it mattered enough that authorities did not brush them aside. Instead, the case triggered a serious response. Police officers, state police, and even military personnel from Fort Campbell became involved in the search of the property. Chief Russell Greenwell was among those who took the situation seriously enough to respond. That response is one of the reasons the case gained such weight, because even if authorities did not conclude that strange creatures had truly surrounded the house, they took the fear seriously enough to investigate immediately. When they arrived at the farm, they found a scene that at least partially matched the family's claim that something chaotic had happened there. There were spent shell casings. There was evidence of gunfire. Screens had been damaged. There were bullet marks on the house and around the property. In other words, there was physical evidence that the household had been firing repeatedly into the night. What officers did not find was the thing that would have resolved the case. No dead creature, no captured intruder, no body, no clear physical proof of the beings the family described. Some later accounts mention odd luminous traces or an unusual glow in the area, but nothing discovered at the scene brought the case to a clean conclusion. And that contrast is one of the most important elements in the story. The evidence supported the reality of panic, but not the identity of its cause. Something had clearly happened, enough to drive the family into fear and provoke a heavily armed response. But whatever they said they saw, it was gone, or at least gone by the time law enforcement searched the place. And yet, the story may not have ended there, because according to some witnesses, after authorities eventually left and the family tried to settle down again, the figures appeared once more. That detail matters because it pushes the case beyond a single burst of panic. It suggests a second phase, not just panic, police, and aftermath, but panic, police, temporary calm, and then a return. One of the most repeated details is that Glennie Langford later woke up and saw a figure looking through the window at around 3:30 in the morning. If true, that would mean the incident extended deeper into the night than many simplified retellings suggest, and narratively, it makes the case feel far more oppressive. The authorities arrive, they search, they leave, the family tries to rest, and still the presence seems to return. That is not the structure of a quick misunderstanding, it is the structure of a prolonged ordeal. Whether the cause was extraordinary, misidentified, psychological, or some combination of several things, the event as experienced by the family seems to have unfolded as a sustained night of siege and fear. And that is exactly why the case did not die when police found no definitive answer, because the lack of proof did not erase the scale of the reaction. If anything, it made the story harder to settle. There are many strange stories in American folklore and UFO history. Most of them fade, but the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter endured, and it endured for specific reasons. The first is the number of witnesses. This was not built around one person claiming to have seen something strange in isolation. There were 11 people at the house. Not all of them described every moment in exactly the same way, and not all accounts are identical in every source, but the central event was collective. A household shared the same night, the same fear, and the same basic claim that something small, strange, and persistent had appeared around the property. The second is duration. This was not remembered as a flash encounter, not a brief roadside glimpse, and not a light in the sky that vanished in seconds. It was remembered as something that lasted for hours. That matters because duration changes the nature of the case. A momentary mistake is one thing. A sustained sequence of repeated appearances is another. The third is the emotional state of the witnesses. Fear is not proof. People can be sincerely afraid and still be mistaken, but sincerity matters when evaluating a story. And in this case, the reactions described by officers and later investigators suggested that the fear inside that household was not casual or theatrical. The people involved appeared to believe they had experienced something real and threatening. The fourth is the stability of the core narrative. There are variations in detail, that is normal in any case with many witnesses and many retellings, but the broad outline remained stable. A strange light seen first, small figures appearing around the house, repeated gunfire, continued reappearances, retreat to the police, official response, no conclusive physical solution. The fifth, police response itself. The family did not hide the story and repeat it later in private. They went directly to law enforcement. Police took them seriously enough to mobilize a substantial response, and officers found a scene consistent with a chaotic, fear-driven event, even if they could not confirm its cause. That does not prove goblins, but it raises the level of the case from campfire tale to documented incident. And then there is one final point. The encounter may not have ended when authorities arrived. According to later accounts, the figures returned after police left. That detail gives the story its lingering edge, because it means the case cannot be reduced so neatly to one burst of panic that disappeared once outside scrutiny arrived. Whether literal, misremembered, or amplified over time, the persistence of that detail became part of what kept the case alive. Taken together, these elements explain why Hopkinsville remained one of the most resilient stories in American UFO history. Not because it offers perfect evidence, it does not. Not because it proves an alien visitation, it does not. But because it occupies a difficult middle ground, too dramatic to dismiss casually, too thin in physical proof to close conclusively, too well remembered to disappear, and too strange to fit comfortably into one satisfying explanation.
One of the reasons the Hopkinsville case remains so difficult to evaluate clearly is that the original event did not stay intact for long. Almost immediately, it began to change in public, not necessarily in the memories of the people who said they were there, but in the way the story was reported, repeated, mocked, and packaged for a wider audience. And that matters because there is a difference between a strange event and the version of that event that survives in popular culture. In the case of Hopkinsville, the media helped create that gap. As newspapers and reporters picked up the story, parts of it were exaggerated, simplified, and turned into something more sensational. The most famous example is the phrase, "little green men." That label became attached to the case so strongly that for many people it effectively replaced the original account. But the witnesses themselves did not describe green creatures. That image was a media construction, a catchy phrase, a distortion, and ultimately a distraction. Because once it took hold, the tone of the case began to shift. What had started as a night of fear for one family was increasingly presented as a bizarre spectacle. Not a serious encounter, not a difficult historical case, but a strange American curiosity. The kind of story people laugh at before they ever examine it. And that matters, because ridicule did not just spread the case, it helped hide what made it difficult. The property drew attention. Curious onlookers, journalists, and tourists came to see the place for themselves. The family, instead of being treated simply as witnesses to something frightening, became objects of fascination and ridicule. And once a case becomes a national joke, its original witnesses often retreat. They become less willing to speak, less willing to relive the experience, and less willing to expose themselves to more humiliation. That does not prove they were telling the truth, but it complicates the idea that the whole event was simply a scheme for attention. Because for the people at the center of it, the attention was not clean or beneficial. It was invasive, mocking, and in many ways punishing. The family was no longer simply a group of frightened people from a rural farmhouse. They had become part of a story the public now consumed as entertainment. That process also distorted later interpretation. When modern audiences hear Hopkinsville Goblins, they often inherit the caricature first: small green aliens, a bizarre monster story, armed hillbillies shooting into the dark. And once that stereotype takes over, it becomes easy to dismiss the case without ever returning to what made it unusual in the first place. The number of witnesses, the immediate police response, the visible signs of panic, the prolonged nature of the event, and the fact that even skeptical explanations, while useful, do not cleanly erase every part of the story. In that sense, the media did not simply spread the case, it reshaped it. It made the story famous, but it also made serious evaluation harder. And for a channel like this, that distinction is crucial. Because if we want to understand why Hopkinsville remained so durable in American memory, we have to separate the original claims from the spectacle built around them. The ridicule became part of the case. The distortion became part of the case. And the public image of little green men ended up obscuring a much more complicated and unsettling story underneath. If Hopkinsville had remained only a local newspaper oddity, it probably would not still be discussed decades later. But the case did not stay local. It entered a broader world of documentation, sketches, interviews, and serious inquiry. That does not mean it was solved, far from it. But it does mean the event continued to attract attention beyond the initial wave of sensational headlines. Some of the earliest visual interpretations of the creatures came through efforts to document what the witnesses said they saw. Among the names associated with those early attempts is Bud Ledwith, who helped produce some of the first drawings based on witness descriptions. Those drawings mattered because they gave the case a more defined identity. They also helped preserve the gap between the witnesses' actual descriptions and the more cartoonish image later spread by the media. Over time, the case also attracted more structured investigation. One of the most important names here is Isabel Davis, who treated the incident seriously and examined it in greater depth. Her interest helped reinforce the idea that Hopkinsville was not just a tabloid curiosity. It was a case worth preserving, comparing, and analyzing. That matters because when a story survives not only in newspapers but also in research circles, it becomes harder to dismiss as nothing more than a passing joke. The case also entered larger conversations within American UFO research. It became one of the classic incidents of the 1950s, often mentioned alongside broader debates about witness reliability, mass experience, anomalous encounters, and the limits of conventional explanation. Project Blue Book is sometimes mentioned in connection with the case, and that wider institutional context helps place Hopkinsville within the broader history of UFO-era America. Still, that point should be handled carefully. Hopkinsville is not important because it can be used as a Blue Book footnote. It is important because it stood on its own. Because even outside the broader UFO machinery of the period, it had its own structure, its own witnesses, and its own unusual durability. Researchers such as J. Allen Hynek would later become part of the wider intellectual environment in which cases like Hopkinsville were reassessed. And that reinforces the same point. This was not simply a one-night media novelty. It became part of an ongoing debate, a case revisited repeatedly, questioned, defended, critiqued, reinterpreted, and never fully put to rest. That is one reason Hopkinsville endured. But the case also survived for another reason. It moved beyond investigation and entered culture itself. It became part of the identity of the Kelly-Hopkinsville area. Over time, it evolved into something larger than a single incident report. It became local legend, regional memory, a story retold across generations, and eventually part of the broader folklore of unexplained America. That afterlife matters because it shows how cases like this survive in more than one form, as possible historical incidents, as subjects of research, and as symbols. Hopkinsville now exists at a strange intersection between documentary case, UFO history, American folklore, media distortion, and local identity. And that layered identity is part of what keeps it alive. The reason Hopkinsville endured, then, is not that it produced final evidence. It did not. It is that it remained unresolved while continuing to attract investigators, skeptics, believers, and the public alike. Something about the structure of the case kept it alive. Not certainty, not proof, but resistance. Resistance to simple explanation, resistance to being forgotten, and resistance to being reduced to one easy category. And that is exactly why, even now, the case still demands a serious look. A case like Hopkinsville only becomes stronger when skepticism is taken seriously. Not because skepticism automatically dissolves the mystery, but because any explanation worth considering has to pass through the most plausible ordinary alternatives first. And in this case, there are several. The first is the simplest explanation for the opening event. The bright object Billy Ray Taylor said he saw in the sky may well have been a meteor. That explanation is not weak. In fact, it may be the most convincing answer for that specific part of the story. A meteor could explain a bright object, an unusual light, an apparent descent, and the immediate sense that something extraordinary had crossed the sky. So if we isolate the first moment of the night, a conventional explanation may be enough. But the Hopkinsville case does not rest on the light alone. It rests on everything that followed. And that leads to the most commonly repeated skeptical explanation of all: owls. More specifically, great horned owls. This theory has endured because it does explain some striking features of the case. Large, reflective eyes seen in darkness, a silhouette that might seem strangely shaped in low light, prominent ear-like features, nocturnal movement, the ability to appear suddenly from trees or roof lines, and in a state of fear, the possibility that an owl seen under unusual conditions could be transformed in the mind into something far stranger. That theory is not trivial. It deserves to be taken seriously, especially in a rural environment, at night, under stress, with armed people already on edge after the report of something in the sky. There is also the broader issue of perception under fear. Once a group believes something threatening is outside, interpretation can shift rapidly. Movements become more menacing, silhouettes become less familiar, ordinary ambiguity becomes charged with meaning. That does not require dishonesty, only stress, low light, expectation, and repetition. The media itself may also have intensified confusion later. Sensational reporting exaggerated some details, distorted others, and made the case easier to retell in ways that were more dramatic than accurate. So even if the original event was strange, the public version of it may have become stranger still. Another skeptical possibility is exaggeration or outright fraud. That idea cannot simply be ignored. Whenever a case becomes famous, the possibility of embellishment has to be considered. Could parts of the story have grown in the retelling? Yes. Could some details have become more vivid over time? Certainly. Could the entire case have begun with panic, misidentification, and then expanded through repetition and attention? That is possible too. And there's another, more nuanced explanation that may fit the case better than either total belief or total dismissal. More than one thing may have happened that night. Billy Ray Taylor may really have seen a meteor or some other ordinary aerial phenomenon. After that, the household may have encountered something terrestrial, poorly identified in the dark. Fear may then have amplified each new appearance. Gunfire, tension, and repetition may have turned confusion into a full narrative of siege. That possibility matters because it avoids a false binary. It does not require extraterrestrials, but it also does not require us to pretend the entire experience was simple. And that may be the most intellectually honest position available. Because the strongest skeptical explanations help. They explain parts of the case. They reduce some of the strangeness. They clarify how fear, darkness, animals, and expectation can interact. But they do not necessarily close every gap completely. If the figures were only owls, why did the event seem to continue for so long? Why did so many people inside the same household maintain such a similar basic account? Why did the experience leave such a strong impression on the responding officers? Why did the family seem to recoil from attention later, instead of embracing it as easy fame? And why has the case remained so resistant to full dismissal, even among people willing to consider ordinary explanations? None of those questions prove the extraordinary, but they do explain why Hopkinsville continues to sit in an uncomfortable middle ground, a place where skepticism is necessary, but where skepticism alone still may not feel entirely sufficient. After all the theories, retellings, and decades of debate, Hopkinsville still comes back to the same problem. It does not disappear cleanly.
That does not mean the extraordinary explanation wins by default. It does not. But it does mean the case remains stronger than many people expect once they look past the caricature. If the figures were only owls, then the question is not whether owls can account for part of the imagery. They can. The real question is whether that explanation, by itself, accounts for the full structure of the night, for the duration, for the repeated appearances, for the sustained sense of siege described by the family, for the way the witnesses claimed the figures moved, recoiled, reappeared, and continued surrounding the property over time. It is possible that fear stretched and distorted perception, but that alone does not automatically explain why the event held together as a multi-hour experience, remembered in such a specific way. If the answer is simply error under stress, then another question appears. Why did the core of the story remain so stable? Not every detail, not every later retelling, but the central pattern, the strange light, the small figures, the repeated gunfire, the house under pressure, the rush to the police, the return to a property showing signs of panic, but no final answer. Cases built entirely on invention often fracture more obviously. They usually carry some internal weakness that becomes easier to spot over time. Hopkinsville did accumulate distortion, especially through the media. But beneath that distortion, the original shape of the incident remained unusually durable. And then there is the issue of motive. If the case had been a deliberate hoax, what exactly was the reward? The family did not emerge from the event as beneficiaries of prestige or admiration. They were mocked. Their story was flattened into a joke. Their image was recast for the public as something closer to a rural spectacle than a serious testimony. That does not make fabrication impossible, but it weakens the idea that this was an easy performance for attention, because the attention that followed was not flattering. It was corrosive. And the more sophisticated possibility remains the most compelling of all, that more than one thing happened that night. That Billy Ray may truly have seen an ordinary but dramatic aerial event. That the family may then have encountered something terrestrial, poorly perceived, and made stranger by darkness, fear, and expectation. That each new moment intensified the next, and that by the end of the night, what they experienced felt absolutely real to them, even if the precise nature of what they saw remained unresolved. This possibility does not solve the case, but it may explain why it has survived. Because it respects complexity. It allows for sincerity without demanding literalism. It allows for fear without demanding fraud. And it allows the event to remain partially open without turning it into proof of anything extraordinary. That is where Hopkinsville still lives, not in certainty, but in resistance. Resistance to dismissal, resistance to complete validation, resistance to a single explanation that closes every door. And maybe that is why the case has endured for so long. Not because it offers one perfect answer, but because each answer leaves something behind, something unresolved, something imperfectly explained, something that keeps the night from collapsing into either total belief or total ridicule. In the end, the Hopkinsville case remains powerful for the same reason it remained famous. Not because it was ever definitively solved, and not because it ever definitively proved anything. It remains powerful because it occupies a rare space between those two extremes. A family in rural Kentucky claimed that small creatures surrounded their house for hours. They reacted with visible fear. They fired repeatedly. They went to the police immediately.
Police took the situation seriously enough to respond in force. The property showed clear signs of chaos and gunfire. The media turned the story into a national spectacle. The phrase, "little green men," buried the original testimony beneath caricature. And yet, even after all the ridicule, all the skepticism, and all the decades of retelling, the case still refuses to collapse into a fully satisfying explanation. Maybe the first light in the sky was a meteor. Maybe some of the figures were misidentified owls. Maybe fear transformed the experience moment by moment. Maybe several ordinary elements collided in exactly the wrong way on exactly the same night. All of that is possible. But even then, one fact remains. Something happened there that terrified those people. Something strong enough to send an entire household running to the police. Something strange enough that, for decades, the case has remained alive in that uneasy territory between history, folklore, ridicule, and mystery. And perhaps that is the real reason Hopkinsville still matters. Not as proof of alien visitors, not as a simple joke, but as one of the clearest examples of how a collective night of fear can become a lasting American mystery.
A case where the witnesses may have misunderstood what they saw. A case where the media certainly distorted what they reported. A case where skepticism explains a great deal. And a case where, even so, the whole story never seems to close completely. So the question that remains is not just what was outside that house in 1955. It is this: what was enough to terrify 11 people for hours, bring police to a Kentucky farmhouse in the middle of the night, and still resist a definitive explanation after all this time? And cases like this remain difficult to forget for the same reason others do. Not because they prove the extraordinary, but because even the strongest explanations still leave part of the night unresolved. If that kind of case interests you, there are other encounters here on the channel that leave behind the same kind of doubt.